Imagine Hercule Poirot, the little Belgian detective, packed like sardines in the chaotic rush of London's underground. His thoughts, as always, sharply observant, dissecting the masses around him with a critical eye. The sweat, the heat, the desperate rush of bodies crammed into the same train. It's a scene that feels both claustrophobic and suffocating. But Poirot, he stands there like a man untouched by the madness. His disdain for the masses is palpable. "There are too many people in the world," he mutters, shaking his head at the sea of unfamiliar faces. It's not just the noise and the bustle that bothers him, but the absolute lack of elegance. Why, he wonders, do women knit on the train? The absurdity of it makes him wince. A woman knitting in a crowded train is a far cry from the sophisticated, alluring femme du monde he so desperately craves. The train jerks and sways, shoving Poirot from one stranger to the next, each bump a reminder of how little grace the world seems to have left. He dreams of a time when women draped in luxury, elegant and unpredictable, would have been enough to stop time. But no, now all he sees are rushed, stressed commuters, knitting with a frantic focus, their faces void of anything remotely intriguing. It's a harsh reality check for a man who once rubbed elbows with royalty, thieves, and women whose very presence made the world seem softer, more elegant. Suddenly, the train lurches to a halt, and Poirot's life takes an unexpected twist. Out of the swarm of ordinary people, his eyes lock on something, or should I say, someone? A woman. But not just any woman, she's a vision, impossible to ignore. A striking figure of opulence, crowned with vibrant exotic feathers, and wrapped in furs that whisper of a far more glamorous world. Her voice, rich and powerful, slices through the clamor of the train station. "It is, mon cher Hercule Poirot," she cries, as if the past had come crashing back to life in the blink of an eye. And yet, the universe has a strange way of playing with timing. The two are trapped in the eternal dance of two escalators moving in opposite directions, doomed never to meet. Poirot leans forward, desperate, calling to her, but the woman, Countess Vera Rosikoff, a name Poirot once dreaded and adored in equal measure, is swept away. "In hell," she says, her voice carrying a mysterious, almost prophetic ring. Poirot is left dumbfounded, his mind racing. Hell? What could she possibly mean by that? The underground? Or is it a cryptic hint about something darker, more treacherous? His heart, long captivated by her wild allure, is once again swept into confusion. "In hell?" he repeats, almost to himself, as if searching for meaning in the absurdity. He knows she's playing a game, and he's both the pawn and the player. With no clear direction, Poirot embarks on a mission the next morning, determined to unravel the mystery. He seeks answers from the unassuming Miss Lemon, his secretary, who, though humorless and impeccably efficient, might hold the key. Her response is as blunt as it is revealing. "It's a nightclub. Hell, they call it," she says, as though she's discussing the weather. "Run by some Russian woman. You'll need a reservation." The evening arrives, and Poirot steps into the unknown. The door swings open, revealing a world of excess, where each step down the stairs brings him closer to the surreal. Neon lights flicker as he descends, each phrase on the walls both mocking and inviting. "I meant well. I can give it up any time I like." As he crosses a bridge over a tank of scarlet lilies, he feels the presence of something sinister. And there, in the shadows, sits the largest, most terrifying dog he's ever seen, an ominous guardian of this underworld. The night deepens and Poirot's curiosity is piqued. The Countess's cryptic words echo in his mind. Is this truly hell? Or is it a world much more dangerous and beguiling than he ever anticipated? As he stands there, caught between past and present, between mystery and reality, one thing is certain. Poirot is once again in the clutches of the dangerous, fascinating world that has always ensnared him. And just like that, he knows that, much like the mythical Cerberus, his journey is just beginning. Poirot stood frozen, his pulse quickening as the unthinkable seemed to materialize before him. He fought against the sickening feeling creeping up his spine, attempting to reason with himself. But the truth was undeniable. It was real. Far too real. His mind screamed for him to dismiss it, dismiss the absurdity, the madness. But the hound, that massive, monstrous creature, shifted. Its head, impossibly large and bristling with menace, turned toward him. The eyes, dark, burning embers, pierced the very air. And then came the growl, a low, thunderous rumble, as though it were emanating from the depths of the earth itself. A sound so deep, so visceral, it made the very atmosphere tremble. It was not just a threat, but a declaration, a warning, one that struck straight to the marrow of his bones. Poirot's heart skipped a beat, but he was not one to yield easily. Yet, in that moment, it was as though the entire world had paused. The very air held its breath. He didn't dare look away. The creature's gaze locked onto him with the kind of focus that sent a jolt of primal fear through even Poirot's composed mind. But it wasn't him the hound was fixated on. Poirot's eyes, drawn by some twisted instinct, followed the path of the creature's gaze. There, beside him, sat a decorative basket, its contents incongruously mundane. Small, round dog biscuits, their presence mocking the gravitas of the moment. And then, the label. The words, so simple, so utterly ridiculous in their certainty. A sop for Cerberus. The absurdity of it all, the irony, the sheer madness, was almost too much for Poirot to bear. Yet the hound didn't look away, not once. Its eyes locked onto the biscuits, burning with an insatiable hunger that threatened to consume the very soul of the room. A growl, sharper and more threatening this time, sliced through the air. The tension in the room grew thicker. Poirot could feel his pulse thudding in his ears, but his resolve remained unshaken. He was Poirot, the master of observation, the solver of impossibilities. He would not falter. Quickly, but with a precision that only he could muster, Poirot seized a biscuit from the basket and hurled it with unanticipated speed. The hound's mouth opened in a monstrous gape, a cavernous abyss that seemed to stretch beyond reason. With a single snap, the biscuit vanished into its maw. Cerberus had been silenced, for the moment. Poirot allowed himself a brief exhale, the tension in his chest finally easing. It was a small victory, but it was enough. But there was no time for triumph. Poirot's mind sharpened once more. The real challenge awaited him beyond the next door, and with purpose he stepped forward. Inside, the atmosphere hit him like a wave. Strange, unsettling, yet unmistakably magnetic. The space was small, almost claustrophobic, but pulsed with an eerie energy. In the center, a dance floor flickered under the glow of crimson lights, casting long, twisted shadows on the faded frescoes that adorned the walls. At the far end of the room, a grill blazed with an infernal intensity. Chefs, dressed as devils in black aprons, flipped skewers with such fervor it seemed as if the flames themselves were alive, hungry for more. Just as Poirot began to absorb the bizarre scene, a voice cut through the chaotic energy like a blade. High-pitched, with the kind of extravagant enthusiasm only a woman of great drama could command. "Ah, you have come, my dear, my very dear friend." The Countess Vera Rosikoff entered like a tempest, her scarlet evening gown practically glowing in the dim light, drawing all eyes to her. She radiated power, confidence, and something far more dangerous, charisma. Her arms swept wide, as if to embrace not just Poirot but the entire concept of friendship itself. "What a joy to see you again," she continued, her voice lilting with playful exaggeration. "After all these years, so many, how many? No, let's not count. To me it seems but yesterday we last met." Her presence filled the room, her energy crackling, as if the very air bent to her will. Poirot, ever the observer, took it all in, his mind already moving, calculating, piecing together the puzzle of this strange encounter. What did it all mean? And why had he, of all people, been drawn into this dizzying web of danger and intrigue? Poirot's bow was as precise as the hand of a watchmaker, each movement measured and deliberate, a man who had navigated the labyrinth of life's complexities with elegance and experience. He took her hand with the reverence of someone who had seen the world at its most wondrous and most wretched. "Nor you, chère amie," he replied, his voice a velvet thread woven with something deeper, a shadow that lingered just beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniably present. His eyes lingered on her face, tracing the years etched into her features, noting the subtle transformations that time had imposed upon her. She wasn't the young beauty he remembered, but she was undeniably striking. A ruin, yes, but a spectacular one, a testament to the kind of woman who could wear age like a crown, with all the grace of a fallen star. Before he could lose himself in the storm of memories, the Countess's voice cut through the haze, vibrant and commanding. "Come, you must meet my friends," she exclaimed, her voice like a wave crashing against the calm of the room. With a sweeping gesture, she motioned toward a nearby table where two figures sat, their presence equally curious. The first was a tall, thin, elderly man, his face the portrait of discomfort. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief as though the very air around him was too much to bear. "This is my friend, my celebrated friend, Monsieur Hercule Poirot," the Countess announced, with all the grandeur of an opera diva making a grand entrance. Her words sparkled with a drama that only she could summon, sending a ripple of curiosity through the room. "He who is the terror of evildoers. I was once afraid of him myself," she continued, her tone teasing, almost flirtatious. "But now I lead a life of the most extreme, the most virtuous dullness. Is it not so?" Poirot's lips curled into a polite but pointed smile, an amused gleam dancing in his eyes. He could never quite escape the Countess's flair for the theatrical. But the tall man, Professor Liskeard, was not so easily swayed. With an exaggerated sigh, he raised a bushy eyebrow, shaking his head as he muttered, "Never say dull, Countess." His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much of the world to find anything dull at all. The Countess laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm, both mocking and affectionate in equal measure. "Ah, Professor Liskeard, the man who knows everything about the past," she announced, her eyes glinting with mischief. "He gave me all the valuable hints for the decorations here." With a grand flourish, she gestured toward the bizarre frescoes that adorned the walls, each more absurd and outlandish than the last. "You see, we are all here for the extreme, the unexpected. Everything in life must be a spectacle, mustn't it?" Poirot's sharp eyes swept over the frescoes, taking in each surreal, mind-bending detail with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed distaste. The first image that caught his attention was that of Orpheus, standing confidently before a jazz band, strumming his lyre as Eurydice gazed longingly at the grill. Yes, the grill, right in the heart of the underworld, no less. Then there was Osiris and Isis, floating serenely on a boat in the afterlife, throwing a party so extravagant it could only have been conceived in the darkest corners of the imagination. and perhaps most absurdly, a scene of youthful revelers caught in a wild orgy of uninhibited chaos, caught somewhere between the madness of nature and the fleeting abandonment of sanity. Each fresco seemed to pulse with life, as though it were more than a mere painting. Each one a reflection of the Countess herself, surreal, provocative, and utterly unpredictable. The absurdity of it all was intoxicating, a chaotic masterpiece of debauchery and delight, crafted with a manic energy that made Poirot feel as if he were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than a mere social gathering. It was madness, yes, but it was also brilliant in its own twisted way. As Poirot's eyes flicked back to the Countess, he could see her standing there, delighting in the reaction her creations provoked. Her smile was as wide as a crescent moon, and her eyes glittered with the thrill of being the architect of such a spectacle. But even as he admired her audacity, Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the glittering surface of her world, something far darker and more dangerous lurked. And for once, the great detective was uncertain whether he was walking into a puzzle to be solved or a trap waiting to be sprung. "This," the Countess said, sensing his confusion, "this is the country of the young." She added, without missing a beat, "And this is my little Alice." Poirot turned to the young woman seated next to the Countess. Alice Cunningham. Her severe appearance, checkered coat, horn-rimmed glasses, and a demeanor that screamed intellectual, immediately put Poirot on edge. Alice, however, offered him a stiff smile and leaned in to speak. "I find her fascinating," Alice said, referring to the Countess, "not just as the mother of the man I intend to marry, but as a case study in psychology." "Really?" Poirot asked, intrigued. "In what sense?" Alice straightened, her voice gaining confidence. "I'm writing a book on criminal psychology. Vera's quirks, shall we say, are particularly illuminating. For instance, her obsession with stealing things. Not money, mind you, but glittering objects like jewels. She has what I call the magpie complex." Poirot was taken aback. "Indeed? I was unaware of this habit." Alice continued, her voice growing colder. "Oh, yes, she's always taken, but never for the reasons you might think. As a child, she was coddled, protected, shielded from the harshness of the world, yet craving the glittering things to fill that emptiness. Fascinating, isn't it?" The night was growing darker, the atmosphere more intoxicating. As the band played louder, Poirot couldn't help but wonder what he'd stumbled into. It was a world that seemed to exist outside the bounds of ordinary morality, a world where the gates of hell were not only open, they were an invitation. But before he could process it further, the Countess, catching his eye, leaned forward. "What do you think, mon cher Hercule? Is it not chic?" she asked, the implication clear. This was a world of excess, and Poirot was a guest of honor. "Very well imagined," Poirot said, his voice calm but his mind racing. "It is. Chic." And so it was. Hell, in all its decadent, intoxicating glory, had not only caught on, it had flourished. Life had become unbearably mundane for her, an endless cycle of monotony. Her very being yearned for something more, something thrilling and dangerous. Drama wasn't just a craving, it was a necessity. Beneath her sophisticated exterior lay a woman desperate for punishment, for notoriety. It was this very desire that fueled her reckless indulgence in theft. She didn't just want to take something, she wanted the thrill of being caught, of being punished. She wanted the world to know her name, to see her as the woman who dared. Poirot, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow, his mind working furiously to untangle the web of contradictions surrounding the mysterious Countess. "But surely, Miss Cunningham," he interjected, his voice smooth yet edged with disbelief, A member of the Russian aristocracy, thrown into the chaos of the revolution, wouldn't have led such a dull, sheltered life, would she? The question hung in the air, as if the very notion of a dull aristocrat was absurd to Poirot's trained mind. Yet, despite his calm exterior, doubt gnawed at him. A faint glimmer of amusement danced behind Alice Cunningham's pale blue eyes, like the flicker of a candle's flame before it disappears into the dark. She regarded him with a cool detachment, her lips curling into the slightest of smirks. "Ah," she responded, her voice a silken challenge. "Did she tell you that?" Her words were like a subtle jab, carefully designed to unearth Poirot's assumptions and expose their fragile foundations. Poirot's brow furrowed, caught in the snare of his own convictions. He pressed on, undeterred. "She is undeniably an aristocrat," he declared, with a firmness that bordered on desperation, as if repeating the words might make them true. But even as he spoke, a strange unease settled over him, the Countess's shifting stories writhing like shadows, casting doubt over everything he thought he knew about her. Miss Cunningham, ever the sharp observer, only shrugged, her indifference a palpable presence. "One believes what one wishes to believe," she remarked, her tone light, but laced with a biting edge. It was as though Poirot's desperate need for certainty, a need that had served him well for years, was nothing more than a quaint little flaw to her, something to be casually dismissed. Poirot felt a pang of discomfort, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. For once, he was being outmaneuvered, and his pride couldn't help but sting. Not one to be easily rattled, Poirot quickly regained his composure, shifting the focus of the conversation as if resetting the chessboard. "But tell me, Miss Cunningham," he said, his voice now laced with challenge, "how is it that someone with such youth, such promise, doesn't make the effort to be more captivating?" His gaze sharpened, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "You dress as though preparing for a round of golf, yet here you are, surrounded by society's finest. Your lips," he added with a calculated glance, "are painted, but there's no fire in them, no passion, no effort to enhance what nature has already given you." For the briefest moment, Miss Cunningham's composure cracked. Just a flicker of something deep and raw flashed across her face. Poirot saw it. A flash of pure, unfiltered anger that she swiftly smothered beneath a mask of practiced indifference. She took a sharp breath, her eyes narrowing, and in that instant Poirot realized he had struck a nerve. With a cool, almost pitying tilt of her head, she finally spoke. "Ah, Poirot," she said, the words slipping from her lips like velvet but carrying a venomous undertone. "You're so far removed from the modern world, aren't you? You still think it's all about appearances." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "But it's not about the surface, Poirot. It's about essence." Her words were dripping with condescension, yet there was something in the detachment, the coolness of her gaze, that sent a chill down Poirot's spine. For the first time in their exchange, Poirot found himself on the defensive, his mind scrambling to catch up with her ruthless precision. Alice Cunningham was no mere distraction. She was a force, one that even the great Hercule Poirot wasn't quite prepared to face. Poirot, frustrated but trying to maintain his usual calm, studied her. Just as he was about to respond, a new figure entered the scene. A young man, dark and handsome, moving with a fluid grace across the room. Alice Cunningham's eyes lit up. "Ah, Paul Varesco," she murmured with interest. "A man with a taste for women and peculiar depraved desires. I have a feeling he'll have some fascinating stories to share." The way she spoke of him sent a chill down Poirot's spine. There was something unsettling about the way she approached these criminal types, as though she were more intrigued than repelled. As the young man glided past, Poirot caught snippets of their conversation. A strange tale of a nursery governess and a toy crane. His mind raced. What were they really talking about? And why was Alice Cunningham so fascinated by the darker side of life? Poirot's musings were interrupted by a sudden realization. The young man at the other table wasn't who he appeared to be. Behind the facade of an idle-rich playboy was a man Poirot recognized well. Detective Inspector Charles Stevens, undercover no doubt. A quiet suspicion crept into Poirot's mind. What was Stevens really up to? The following morning, Poirot paid a visit to Scotland Yard, seeking answers from his old friend, Chief Inspector Japp. Japp's response was far more open than Poirot expected. "Poirot, you sly fox, how do you always manage to get to the heart of things?" Japp chuckled, clearly impressed. But when Poirot pushed further, Japp's tone shifted. "Ah, hell," he said with a knowing look. "On the surface, it's just another hotspot for the elite, but we've got a feeling there's something darker going on. Drugs, jewels, it's all connected." Poirot listened intently, piecing together the fragments of information. The woman at the center of it all, the Russian countess, was no simple aristocrat. Behind her facade was a complex web of lies, deceit, and criminal activity. The jewels were being traded for drugs, and the players involved were not who they seemed. Poirot's mind was working at full speed. This was a case of deception at its finest. He couldn't let the women of society fall prey to this dangerous game. And at the heart of it all, Paul Varesco seemed to be the key. But Poirot knew better than anyone that things were rarely as they appeared on the surface. He needed to dig deeper, and he wasn't about to let Alice Cunningham or anyone else stand in his way. As Poirot stood, the atmosphere in the club grew heavier, and the laughter of the Countess seemed to echo through the room like a haunting reminder of the dangerous game being played. The air, thick with intrigue, made every step toward the exit feel like a decision that could change everything. Poirot turned back to the Countess, his eyes narrowing as he regarded her more closely. "You know, I must confess," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "there's something that bothers me about this whole charade. You see, I've been watching you closely." The Countess raised an eyebrow, her playful demeanor faltering just for a moment. "Mon cher, what do you mean? I have nothing to hide." "Oh, but I beg to differ," Poirot replied, his gaze hardening. "Your little story about Dudu, that's not what worries me. No, it's something far more significant. You see, I've been working my way through the pieces of this puzzle, and I've come to a conclusion I wasn't expecting." A strange silence fell over the table. The Countess, who had been laughing just moments ago, suddenly seemed distant, her playful smile fading into something darker, something that seemed almost like a mask. "You've been keeping something from me, haven't you?" Poirot continued, leaning in slightly. "This club, your partnership with Varesco, it's all a facade, isn't it? You and Varesco, you're not just running this place, you're using it for something far more sinister. Drugs, yes, but there's something more, something international." The Countess's face tightened, her eyes flickering with a mixture of defiance and fear. "You've been quite clever, Poirot," she said, her voice cold now, "but cleverness won't save you." Before Poirot could respond, there was a sudden crash from across the room. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The entire club seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows. Paul Varesco, his eyes wild, his hand clutching a gun. "Don't move!" Varesco shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You've uncovered too much, Poirot, and now you're going to regret it." The Countess, her earlier calm shattered, stood quickly, her face pale. "Paul, no!" she cried, reaching out toward him. "This wasn't part of the plan." But Poirot remained unmoved, his mind racing. In an instant, he knew what was happening. This was not about drugs. This was something much more dangerous. International smuggling, corruption, and hidden alliances that extended far beyond the club's walls. Varesco, desperate and panicked, was the final piece of the puzzle. Poirot's eyes locked onto Varesco, his voice steady despite the tension. "You made a mistake, my friend. You thought you could pull the strings, but now you've trapped yourself." Varesco's hand tightened around the gun, but he faltered. Poirot's calmness, his unwavering confidence, had unsettled him. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked from behind Varesco. Inspector Stevens, whom Poirot had quietly alerted earlier, stepped into view, his gun aimed squarely at Varesco's back. "Put it down, Varesco," Stevens commanded, his voice firm. "You're surrounded." The Countess's face went ashen. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "You set us up, Poirot?" "You knew?" Poirot smiled gently, but there was a coldness to it that sent a shiver down her spine. "Ah, madame, there is always more to a puzzle than meets the eye. You were right to be cautious of me, but now the game is over." As Varesco slowly dropped the gun, Poirot stepped forward, his tone as calm as ever. "Now, I believe we shall all take a little trip, straight to Scotland Yard." Scene continues with Poirot and the Countess in the room. A faint hint of tension is in the air, the night deep and filled with secrets. Poirot, his voice calm but sharp. "Ah, Vera, my dear Countess, I must admit I am impressed. You've quite the knack for creating confusion. But you see, you have underestimated one thing. Me." Countess Rosikoff, her smile faltering slightly, her eyes betraying a flicker of hesitation. "Mon cher Hercule, you flatter me. I had no intention of confusing you. But you must understand the circumstances are complex." Poirot, raising an eyebrow. "Ah, complex, you say?" "I am inclined to disagree, my dear. Nothing about this is complex. In fact, it is quite simple. You planned to slip the emeralds into my pocket, but the lights went out, and instead they ended up in Professor Liskeard's. I am curious, though. Why the haste? Why me?" Countess Rosikoff laughs softly, almost nervously, and glances toward the window. "You always see through me, don't you, Hercule? I wanted to trust you, but the game was getting dangerous, and I had no choice but to act swiftly." Her voice dips lower, a hint of regret in her tone. "You see, these emeralds are not just stones. They are part of something far more valuable." Poirot, leaning forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ah, valuable. You speak of a treasure, perhaps. A treasure hidden in plain sight, surrounded by lies and deception. But tell me, Vera, did you ever stop to consider the consequences of your actions? What if someone had gotten wise to your little game?" Countess Rosikoff. Her face grows tense and she paces slowly, as if searching for the right words. "I didn't think it would come to this. When I first joined forces with Varesco, it was only to protect the interests of the club. But soon things got out of hand. People began to notice the missing shipments. The pressure mounted, and I needed a way to keep things in my control." She stops pacing and faces Poirot. "And I trusted you, Hercule. I thought you might be the one to help me get out of this mess." Poirot. His gaze softens, but there's a note of steel in his voice. "Ah, but trusting me, Vera, is not the same as deceiving me. You did not see me as your ally until you were already trapped, and only then did you scramble to cover your tracks. What makes you think I would allow you to slip past my notice?" Countess Rosikoff. Her expression hardens, a flicker of anger flashing in her eyes. "You are so certain of yourself, Poirot, but you have no idea what it's like to be caught in the web of power and greed, to have to choose between loyalty to those who helped you rise and the fear that they will tear you down when they no longer find you useful." Poirot. His voice grows calm but carries a weight of unspoken truth. "Fear, my dear Countess, is what makes criminals of us all. But there is another choice, isn't there? You could have chosen honesty, even in this mess, but instead you choose to lie, to manipulate, to hide behind clever words." Countess Rosikoff. She laughs, but it's empty, bitter. "Honesty, Poirot? And what good would that have done me? You of all people know what the world demands. It demands power, control. It doesn't care for truth unless it suits its own purposes." She shakes her head, a sad smile forming on her lips. "If I had come to you sooner, if I had trusted you fully, would you have saved me from all of this? Or would you have turned me away like all the others?" Poirot pauses for a moment, studying her closely. "That, my dear Countess, is a question I cannot answer, because it's not a matter of saving you from yourself. No one can do that." He stands, moving toward the door, his tone now shifting to something almost melancholy. "You see, Vera, the real question is, how much of this can you undo before it is too late? How much of your tangled web can be unraveled?" Countess Rosikoff. She walks over to him, her hand trembling slightly as she reaches for his sleeve. "Poirot, please, you've said it yourself. There is always a way out. Help me. I know the game is over, but I can still make it right if you will just—" Poirot gently removes her hand, his eyes soft but unyielding. "I cannot help you, Vera, not in the way you hope. But I will not stand in the way of what you choose next." He turns, looking back at her one last time. The question, as always, is, how far are you willing to go, to live with your own choices? The tension in the room was palpable as Hercule Poirot stood calmly, his eyes narrowing slightly as the Countess Rosikoff began speaking again, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and regret. "I snatch it back," she exclaimed, gripping the velvet bag tightly in her hands. "But as I feel through it, there's something hard inside. I slip my hand in, and that's when I know. I can tell just by touch. Jewels, Poirot. Jewels. And I know, instantly, who's behind this. It's that vile, deceitful, slippery snake, Paul Varesco." Poirot remained silent, the corners of his mouth twitching upward as he listened intently. The Countess paced the room, her footsteps sharp against the floor. She seemed to be unraveling, her face flushed with anger. "Yes, I know. That filthy rat, that double-crossing lizard, Varesco, the one who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes, pretending to be a man of honor while he's smuggling drugs right under our noses." She pointed accusingly at Poirot. "You've figured it all out, haven't you? You've been watching him from the start, pretending to be fooled. You knew what was going on, didn't you?" Poirot's voice was calm, but filled with an almost imperceptible edge. "Calm yourself, my dear Countess," he said softly. "Come, let us step into the next room." He motioned toward a door at the far end of the room. As they entered, a small room loomed before them, seemingly filled with only one occupant, a large, imposing dog. The Countess gasped as her eyes locked onto the massive creature. "Mon Dieu, what is this?" she exclaimed, her hands going to her chest in shock. Poirot smiled, his tone almost playful as he introduced the small, nondescript man standing next to the beast. "Allow me to present Mr. William Higgs," Poirot announced, "a true master of his craft. Mr. Higgs, during the chaotic events of the evening, succeeded in luring Cerberus out of his hell." The little man, Mr. Higgs, smiled bashfully, his rat-like features barely visible in the dim light. "Ah, well, Governor, it's a simple trick, really. Dogs, see? They're not so hard to handle when you know what to offer them," he muttered, a glint of pride in his eyes. "Give 'em what they want, and they'll follow you anywhere." The Countess stared at the man, confusion written all over her face. "What do you mean? How could you possibly have gotten Cerberus to follow you?" Mr. Higgs scratched his chin, looking embarrassed but amused. "Ah, it's not so complicated, ma'am. Dogs, especially ones trained for a job, they're loyal. You just show 'em the right thing, and they'll do anything for you. Cerberus here is no different. He's just a dog with a very big mouth." The Countess blinked in disbelief, her attention now fixed entirely on Cerberus, who had barely moved save for the rhythmic thumping of his tail. "But why? Why are you showing me this?" Poirot, his face serious now, stepped forward. "Ah, my dear, it is all part of the plan. You see, Cerberus carries something very important, and the question is, what does he carry? Watch closely." With a gentle yet deliberate motion, Poirot reached into the dog's mouth and pulled out a small pink package wrapped in rubber. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small but highly dangerous packet of white powder, cocaine. The Countess gasped, her face turning pale. "What is this? What does this mean, Poirot?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. Poirot's expression remained calm, but his words were laced with warning. "Cocaine, my dear Countess. A small amount, yes, but enough to bring ruin, enough to destroy lives and turn innocent lives into victims of greed and power." She took a step back, shaking her head. "No, no, you must be mistaken. I had no idea, Poirot, I swear to you, I had no idea my hell was being used for such an abhorrent purpose." Poirot shook his head slowly, his voice filled with disappointment. "I do not doubt you, Vera, but it is the people you associate with, the ones you allow into your world, that cause the damage, the ones who take advantage of your trust. Tell me, who was it that hid this in Cerberus's mouth?" She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze shifting between Poirot and the dog. I don't know. I couldn't have known," she stammered. Poirot's eyes softened, but his words were still firm. "I know, my dear, but someone knew, someone used you, and if not for the careful eye of Hercule Poirot, you might have been caught in their web." The Countess crumpled into a chair, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, my Nicky," she whispered. "What will become of him? What will happen to him now?" Poirot stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Do not worry. There are many other opportunities for young men like him in America, and you, Vera, have saved him from a far worse fate. Thanks to your actions, his future remains bright." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You think so?" she asked, her voice trembling. Poirot nodded, a small but reassuring smile gracing his lips. "Indeed, but for you, your son's future would be compromised, trapped in a world of crime. Now, he has the chance to start anew. You have made the right choice." The Countess closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. Thank you, Poirot. You are truly a genius." She reached up, and in a spontaneous burst of emotion, she wrapped her arms around him in an embrace. Poirot stood still for a moment, taken aback by the sudden affection, but allowed her to hold him for just a few seconds before gently pulling away. Mr. Higgs, observing the scene with a knowing look, remarked, "Well, Governor, that's a fine way to solve a case. But, what about the dog? Cerberus? He's not going back to hell, is he?" Poirot gave a slight chuckle, adjusting his bow tie as he stood upright. "Ah, Cerberus is not my problem, Higgs. He returned to hell just as planned. But as for the rest of this, well, let's just say that the truth has come to light, and those who need to know it will." A week later, as Poirot sat in his office, Miss Lemon came in with an envelope, handing him a bill. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Is it all right for me to pay this? It's from Leonora Florist. Red roses, £11, 8 shillings and sixpence. Sent to Countess Vera Rosakoff." Poirot's face flushed, a rare sight for the meticulous detective. He cleared his throat and straightened his jacket. "Ah, Miss Lemon, perfectly in order. A small gesture, a tribute, if you will, a celebration of new beginnings." Miss Lemon raised an eyebrow. "I see, but you're blushing." Poirot chuckled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "There are moments, Miss Lemon, when one does not economize. When the occasion calls for it, one does what is necessary." And with that, Hercule Poirot walked out of his office, humming a cheerful tune, his step light, almost sprightly. Miss Lemon stood by her desk, watching him go, her curiosity piqued. "Good gracious," she muttered. "I wonder, could it be?" Poirot's response, though unspoken, was clear. In the game of life, sometimes even the greatest of detectives allow themselves a moment of mystery.